My name is Leah Mercer and I was 42 years old, sitting in my parents' attorney's office on a Monday afternoon in October, when my older brother set both hands flat on the mahogany table and said, "Before we go any further, I think we all know who the house should go to." He said it with the calm confidence of someone who had already spent the drive there rehearsing the sentence and believed the room would agree with him once he said it out loud. My brother Daniel was 48. He was the oldest of the five of us and had spent most of his adult life walking into rooms as if structure appeared naturally around him. He had a way of arranging his face into concern when he wanted authority to look compassionate. It was a skill he had developed over years of family discussions in which he positioned himself not as controlling, exactly, but as the person most willing to make difficult decisions for everyone else. We were sitting in a conference room with one narrow window, 6 leather chairs, a box of tissues placed in the exact center of the table, and a framed painting of a sailboat on the opposite wall that looked like it had been chosen by someone who wanted the room to suggest seriousness without feeling cold. The attorney, a man named Howard Bell, sat at the head of the table with 2 folders in front of him and the expression of someone who was already aware this meeting was not going to proceed in a straight line. My sister Joanna was beside Daniel, straight back and silent, the way she always became when she wanted to be seen as the reasonable one. She was 46 and had perfected a particular kind of composure over the years, the kind that made emotional distance look like maturity. My younger brother Mark, who was 39, sat to my left and looked at his hands as if he hoped the meeting might occur without requiring him to participate in it. My youngest sister Emily, 34, had been crying on and off since we arrived and was holding a cup of coffee she had not touched. I sat near the end of the table with my bag at my feet and my hands folded in my lap. The house Daniel was talking about was our parents' home in Ashford County, a white 2-story farmhouse on 37 acres with a red barn that had not held livestock in 20 years and a wraparound porch our father rebuilt twice because he said the first time had been practical and the second time had been right. It was the house all 5 of us had grown up in. It was the house my mother planted peonies beside every spring and my father repaired one room at a time every winter whether it needed it or not. It was also, as of 3 weeks earlier, the only thing any of my siblings had any real interest in discussing. My father had died first, stroke, 18 months before, sudden enough to feel cruel, long enough in the hospital to rearrange everyone's expectations before the end came. My mother had died 11 weeks ago after a quieter decline, not from one dramatic illness but from the cumulative narrowing of a body that had been losing ground for years and had finally decided, in a way bodies sometimes do, that it was finished negotiating. For 18 months after my father's death, my mother had continued living in the house alone. This was the part of the story everyone referred to when they wanted to describe themselves favorably. Daniel said he had called every Sunday. Joanna said she had managed the medication spreadsheet. Emily said she had sent groceries every Thursday. Mark said he had handled the roof repair estimate. All of these things were true. None of them had lived there. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Not to the attorney's office, not to the mahogany table, further back, to a family that had built its understanding of love around usefulness, and to 2 parents who had spent years watching their children mistake performance for presence. There were 5 of us in 14 years, which meant our family moved in waves rather than one clean generation at a time. Daniel was the firstborn and knew it. Joanna came next and spent most of her childhood perfecting herself against Daniel's loud certainty. I was the middle child, which in our family did not mean ignored exactly. It meant available. Mark arrived with enough distance from me to avoid being absorbed into my role, and Emily, the youngest by 5 years, got the gentlest version of our parents because by then they had learned that discipline and worry are not the same thing. Our father, Thomas Mercer, had owned a hardware store in town for 33 years. He was a man who trusted routines more than speeches and who believed almost every problem in the world improved if someone showed up on time with the right tools. Our mother, Ruth Mercer, had taught piano lessons out of the front room of the house until arthritis made it difficult for her hands to keep the shape of the work. She was quieter than our father but harder to misread. My father loved in task. My mother loved in observation. He built things for people. She noticed what they were doing while he built them. Between the 2 of them, they created a household where reliability was admired and emotional dramatic were treated as a form of poor planning. Daniel thrived there. He was good at visible competence. He mowed lawns before being asked, carried groceries in one trip, and knew by 14 how to stand near our father in the garage with a wrench in his hand and absorb approval just by being useful within reach of it. Joanna learned a different method. She was the child who anticipated needs before anyone voiced them. She set the table without being told and learned early that neatness can become a kind of moral language in certain families. She brought home perfect grades with the quiet intensity of someone who had decided the safest way to matter was to leave no flaws visible enough for criticism. I became the child who understood moods. This is not a small role in a large family. It is not visible the way chores are visible, but it is labor all the same. I could tell from the sound of our father setting down his keys whether dinner would be easy. I could tell from the way my mother moved at the stove whether she had gotten bad news from one of her sisters on the phone. I learned, without anyone teaching me directly, that smoothing the emotional weather made the house easier for everyone else to inhabit. Mark avoided the whole system by becoming funny. That is too simple a sentence for what he actually did, but close enough to be useful. He discovered early that if he could make people laugh, they would forgive him for not being as driven as Daniel or as polished as Joanna or as quietly responsive as I had become. He built his place in the family out of charm and strategic underperformance and carried that method so well into adulthood that most people never realized how much of his life was organized around avoiding any role that might trap him. Emily, because she arrived last and after a 5-year gap, had the freedom of being loved after our parents were already tired enough to separate expectation from identity. She was soft-spoken and bright and had a way of making people tell her things because they felt, in her company, that being gentle might be safe. Our mother worried about her in a way she had not worried about the rest of us, maybe because Emily looked like tenderness in a family that respected endurance more openly. If you had asked any of us 10 years ago which child was closest to our parents, each of us would have answered differently and in a way that revealed more about ourselves than about the truth. Daniel would have said him, because he called often and handled practical matters and believed proximity was measurable in responsibilities performed. Joanna would have said no one, because she distrusted the whole language of favoritism and preferred systems in which love was equal because it was efficiently distributed. Mark would have joked that Emily was the favorite and then watch everyone's reaction before deciding whether to mean it. Emily would have said me, and I would have said none of us in the way we imagined. I was the one who moved back, not dramatically, not after a public family rupture or a crisis no one else could solve. I moved back 6 years before my mother died because my marriage ended and because the university where I had been working as an academic advisor eliminated my position in the same season and because a person can only tell herself that upheaval is temporary for so long before she has to choose an actual direction. Ashford County was not the life I had expected to return to at 36, but the house had a room upstairs my mother still called the blue room even though it had not been blue since 1998, and my father said I could stay until I figured things out, and my mother said nothing at all, which in her language often meant yes with less embarrassment attached to it. I took a temporary position at the public library in town. Temporary became permanent 18 months later when the director retired and I was offered her role. I moved from the blue room to the small apartment over the detached garage after my father renovated it and called it an investment in privacy for both of us. I stayed. Staying is easy to misinterpret when you are the child who does it and not the siblings who moved away. To my siblings, I think, it looked as though I had remained because I had nowhere larger to go. There is some truth in that, but there is another kind of truth too, which is that I liked being near my parents in the ordinary season of their lives. I liked coffee with my mother at 6:30 in the kitchen while she adjusted the blinds one slat at a time. I liked the hardware store stories my father told twice because he had forgotten he told them already. I liked knowing which step on the back stairs still creaked in wet weather and which cupboard door had to be closed with your hip. None of this felt noble while it was happening. It felt like life. That distinction matters, because families often build moral rankings out of whatever is easiest to count. Phone calls, grocery deliveries, travel time, expense, public effort. What they rarely know how to measure is unremarkable presence. The person already in the room tends to disappear inside everyone else's narration of who helped. That was true for years. When my father had the stroke, I was in the kitchen with him. He had been peeling an apple badly because his hands had gotten less steady over the previous winter and he refused to let that mean anything yet. He dropped the knife. He sat down too hard. The left side of his face did something strange and small and immediate. I called 911 before he hit the floor. Daniel was 3 hours away. Joanna was on a plane to Denver for work. Mark was in Charlotte. Emily was at her daughter's school play. They all arrived later. They all cried in hospital hallways. They all did what people do when sudden illness rearranges the geometry of a family. I do not say that critically. I say it because it is true. After my father died, everyone became conscientious. Daniel set up recurring deliveries for furnace filters and smoke detector batteries. Joanna created a shared online calendar for medical appointments and lawn service and prescription renewals. Emily began ordering groceries and birdseed and little things my mother had never bought for herself because she considered them non-essential. Mark visited 3 times in 6 months and each visit included one visible repair project that gave him the relief of feeling useful and the praise that usually followed. My mother accepted all of it politely. She thanked everyone. She wrote notes. She kept a list in the kitchen drawer of who had done what because she was not an ungrateful woman. But she never stopped looking at me in that specific way she had when she was taking in a thing completely and saying nothing yet. The year after my father died was not dramatic from the outside. My mother's health declined the way many older women's health declines, through a series of unmanageable losses that become unmanageable only when viewed in total. Her hips worsened. Her balance became unreliable. She tired more easily. She stopped going upstairs except when absolutely necessary and then, eventually, not at all. We moved a bed into the sewing room off the den because the den had the best winter light and because she said if she had to become the sort of woman who lived mostly on one floor she at least intended to do it with a view of the pasture. I was the one there in the mornings. The medications, the tea, the blood pressure log, the hearing aid batteries, the small negotiations over whether she would use the walker in the hallway if no one outside the family was there to see it. Daniel called every Sunday. Joanna texted every Tuesday and Friday and sent lists. Emily shipped groceries every Thursday and came when she could. Mark handled projects. All of this was real. All of it mattered. And still, when the realtor first came to the house, none of my siblings told me. I found out by accident 3 weeks after my mother's funeral. I had gone into town early for coffee and came back to find a black SUV in the drive and a woman in a camel coat standing on the porch with Daniel and Joanna while they looked at the front columns as though they were already discussing improvements to a listing photo. I parked beside the barn and walked toward them. Daniel turned first. He looked guilty for half a second, which on him was the equivalent of an apology. Leah, he said, we were going to call you. The realtor smiled with the professional neutrality of someone who had entered a family scene and intended not to remain in it any longer than necessary. Joanna said, we're just getting a sense of the market. I looked at her. The market for the house, she said. I remember the exact sensation of that moment. Not anger first, not even hurt. It was the peculiar numb clarity that comes when other people reveal the story they have been telling about your life and it is smaller than the life itself. I said, Mom has been dead 19 days. Daniel said, yes, which is why we need to start thinking practically. There are families where that word, practically, means with wisdom. In ours it often meant in a way that protects the speaker from having to admit the emotional reality is inconvenient. I asked, did she tell you she wanted the house sold? Joanna crossed her arms. She said, it's a 37-acre property with deferred maintenance and tax implications. Nobody is moving in. What else would happen to it? I looked at Daniel. He was already in the version of the conversation where decisions had momentum and my role was to stop being difficult enough for him to continue. I said nothing then because my mother had taught me that silence can force people to keep talking until they reveal the thing they thought they had concealed. Daniel obliged. He said, obviously the proceeds would be divided fairly. And if there are sentimental items you want to discuss, we can do that separately. If there are sentimental items, I have thought about that sentence often since then. Not because it was particularly cruel, because it was ordinary. Ordinary in the way family disregard often is. They did not think they were erasing my life in that house. They simply did not know enough about it to understand that was what they were doing. The attorney in October had not yet opened the folder. Daniel still had both hands on the table. Howard Bell said, perhaps we should begin with the terms of your parents' estate before we discuss assumptions. Daniel leaned back. He said, of course. Howard opened the first folder. He looked at me once, then at the others. Your parents updated their estate plan 4 years ago, he said, and again 14 months ago, after Mr. Mercer's stroke. Joanna's posture changed slightly at that. Daniel frowned. Emily looked up from her coffee. Mark finally raised his eyes. Howard continued, under the primary terms of the revised estate, liquid assets have been divided equally among the 5 children. Personal effects are addressed in a separate memorandum. The house and attached acreage. He stopped there, just long enough for the room to understand the sentence was about to become the center of everything. Were transferred by deed 3 years ago. Nobody moved. Daniel said, I'm sorry, what? Howard Bell repeated it exactly the same way. The house and attached acreage were transferred by deed 3 years ago. To whom? Joanna asked. Howard looked down at the document in front of him, although he already knew the answer. To Leah Mercer. For one full second no one in the room made a sound. Then Emily said my name very quietly, not as a question exactly but as a way of setting the fact gently into air she knew would not hold it well. Daniel looked at me as if I had just revealed a second language. Mark said, transferred how? By warranty deed, Howard replied. Properly executed, properly filed, effective immediately as of the date of transfer. Your parents retained a life estate arrangement for occupancy and use during their lifetimes. Upon the death of the surviving parent, full unencumbered possession passed automatically to Ms. Mercer. Joanna turned to me. Did you know about this? I said, yes. That single word changed the room more than the deed had, because up until that point, they could still imagine a misunderstanding, an eccentric legal structure, a clerical oddity, but the fact that I knew meant something else. It meant there had been a private line of reality running beneath the family's public assumptions for years, and they had not been included in it. Daniel sat back slowly. He said, when? 3 years ago, I said. No one spoke. Howard Bell, with the calm of someone who had sat through many versions of family shock and did not intend to become part of this one, closed the first folder and opened the second. There is also a letter, he said, from your mother, with instructions that it be read if there was confusion or dispute about the house. Daniel laughed once, without humor. Confusion Confusion, he said. That's one word for it. Howard unfolded a single page. Your mother wrote this 8 months before her death, he said. In her own hand. I've verified that all parties named here are already aware of the legal transfer, except where otherwise noted. He looked at the page. Then he began to read. Your mother wrote, Howard said, that the house was not left to the child who needed it most, nor to the child who lived closest, nor to the child who called most often after your father died. He paused. She wrote that the house was left to the child who understood the difference between visiting and staying. No one moved. Howard continued. She wrote that all of you loved your parents in the ways you were able to love them. She did not question that, but she wanted the record to reflect that love expressed through scheduling, advice, expense, or management is not the same thing as presence, and presence, in the final years of a life, has a weight that cannot be divided equally after the fact. Daniel's jaw tightened. Joanna stared at the table. Emily had put both hands around her coffee cup as though it were suddenly cold. Mark was looking at me now with an expression I could not yet read. Howard read on. She wrote that when your father died, each of you responded according to your nature. Daniel organized. Joanna optimized. Mark repaired. Emily comforted. Leah remained. The room went very still after that sentence. I had not seen the letter before. I want to say that clearly, because I think what happened next is more understandable if you know that. I had known about the transfer. I had signed papers 3 years earlier in this same office after my father, whose handwriting had started to betray him by then, asked Howard to walk us through every page twice. But I had not asked what my mother intended to say about it later. I had not asked because I believed, perhaps naively, that the legal fact would be enough. I underestimated my family's need for narrative. Howard kept reading. Your mother wrote that the transfer was completed in advance because she and your father had both lived long enough to watch families turn caregiving into accounting. She did not intend to let that happen to this house. She wrote that the house had not been maintained by affection alone. It had been kept alive by daily attention, by weather watched in real time, by small repairs noticed before they became large ones, by meals carried from one room to another, by medicine given at the right hour, by the willingness to have one's own life narrowed by another person's needs without announcing the sacrifice each time. Daniel interrupted. That's unfair. Howard looked up but did not stop reading. It is not my language, Mr. Mercer. It is your mother's. Daniel sat back. I watched him press his thumb into the edge of the table the way he used to do when he was trying not to argue with our father and had not yet learned how to stop himself internally. Howard went on. She wrote that none of you were punished. The liquid estate was divided equally because equal inheritance of money was straightforward and just. The house was different. The house contained labor, memory, time, and stewardship. She and your father had decided that the person who had already been treating it as a life rather than an asset should not have to defend that life after they were gone. Emily made a sound then, almost imperceptible. Not a sob. More like the involuntary breath someone takes when a sentence lands exactly where she knew it would and hurts anyway. Joanna spoke first. What does treating it as a life mean? She asked. Howard folded the letter carefully before answering, as though he understood the reading was complete and what followed was no longer legal. I believe, he said, your mother meant that Ms. Mercer's relationship to the property was not contingent on its future sale value. Joanna looked at me. Her voice was calm in the particular way calm can become when it is protecting a person from embarrassment. Did you ask them for this? No, I said. Did you know they were going to do it before they told us? I held her gaze. They didn't tell you. That landed harder than I expected. Mark let out a breath and looked down. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Daniel leaned forward again, not aggressive exactly, but in the posture of a man who still believed logic might rescue him from a fact. He said, okay, fine. Maybe mom and dad had reasons. But 3 years ago? That means while they were alive, before any of us had a chance to discuss long-term care or what might happen after. I said, after what? He looked at me. After mom died. I nodded. And before she died, what did you think was happening here? He opened his mouth, closed it. This is the point in the story where some people expect me to tell you I had always wanted the house, that I had secretly hoped for exactly this outcome and had played a long game with my parents until they rewarded me for it. That version would be simpler. It would also be untrue. The first time my father raised the idea of transferring the property, I said no. We were sitting on the back porch in late November, a week after he came home from rehab and a month before he admitted to any of us except my mother and me that he knew he would not fully recover. The field behind the barn had gone golden flat. My father had a blanket over his knees and a notebook in his lap full of figures that looked more like carpentry measurements than estate planning. He said, your mother and I have been thinking. I said, that sentence has never introduced anything small. He smiled at that. Then he held out the notebook. It was not dramatic. Numbers, taxes, property lines, the life estate arrangement, the legal structure that would let them continue living there without uncertainty while ensuring that after they were gone no one could force a sale by majority pressure or emotional consensus or some version of fairness that ignored actual history. I understood the logic immediately. I still said no. My father listened the way he always listened when he had already formed an opinion opinion but respected the person disagreeing enough to hear the full draft of it. I told him the others would see it as favoritism. I told him they would think I had influenced them. I told him I did not want the house badly enough to spend the rest of my life becoming the villain of the story they told about our family. He said something then that I did not fully understand until years later. He said, "Leah, the people who arrive for the harvest always believe they help plant." My mother came out onto the porch carrying tea and heard the last part. She set the tray down and said, "And the people who live somewhere while it is unfashionable are usually the ones strangers call lucky later." Then she sat down beside him and said, "We are not rewarding you. We are describing reality before someone else gets to rewrite it." I remember being silent after that, not because I was persuaded emotionally, because I knew they were right legally and morally and still dreaded what rightness would cost. My mother said, "If we leave this for after, everyone will count the visible things. Visit, expenses, calls, suggestions. They will count everything except the life itself because the life itself is too ordinary to photograph." Then she looked directly at me in the way she did when she had reached the exact sentence she meant. "You have already paid for this house in time," she said. "We are making sure no one asks you to buy it again with guilt." I said yes a week later. Howard Bell had remained silent while all of us sat in the room with my mother's letter between us like a new version of family history none of us had prepared to inherit. Daniel was the first to recover enough to sound like himself. He said, "If this was about caregiving, then why not discuss it openly? Why not tell us?" Howard answered before I could. "Your parents' instruction on that point was explicit," he said. "They believed advanced disclosure would create pressure on Ms. Mercer while your mother was still alive. They preferred a completed transfer to a prolonged family negotiation." Daniel almost smiled, but it was not amusement. It was recognition. "That sounds like Dad," he said. "No," I said. "That sounds like Mom." He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time that afternoon I think he saw not the sister who had been geographically available, not the unmarried daughter who stayed local, not the quiet middle child who made logistics easier, but a person our parents had been conferring with as an adult for years in a way he had not noticed because it had not happened in rooms he entered. Joanna said, "Did Mom at least explain why she never said anything to us herself?" Howard lifted the page. "There is one final paragraph." He read, "She wrote that silence is not always concealment. Sometimes it is a boundary placed around peace while there is still peace to protect. She wrote that she did not owe her children a debate about whether the life being lived in front of them was real. She trusted that if any of you loved your sister well, you would eventually understand." Emily started crying then, quietly, and without drama, the way some adults cry only when they have been trying not to for too long. Mark leaned back in his chair and rubbed one hand over his face. Daniel looked out the narrow window. Joanna asked if she could see the letter. Howard handed it across the table. She read it silently. Then she passed it to Daniel, who read more slowly than she had. Emily did not ask for it. Mark did. I waited. This part was difficult in a way I did not expect. Not because I doubted my parents' decision. Because watching your siblings receive a truth about you that they should perhaps have known already carries a particular sadness. It is not triumph. It is the grief of realizing how invisible your real life has been to people who consider themselves close to you. When Mark finished reading, he set the page down and looked at me. "Did you ever think about telling us?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Why didn't you?" "Because Mom asked me not to. And because I knew you'd all spend the rest of her life reacting to the future instead of participating in the present." He nodded slowly. That sounded enough like our mother that no one challenged it. The meeting ended without resolution because there was no resolution available. The documents were clear. The transfer was complete. The emotional aftermath had nowhere formal to go. Howard Bell explained the remaining distribution of liquid assets and personal effects. He asked each of us to sign acknowledgments. Daniel signed with the hard, controlled penmanship of someone who intends the paper to understand he disapproves. Joanna signed neatly. Mark signed and sat back as if relieved the legal part was over. Emily cried onto one of the tissues and apologized, which made Howard awkward in a gentle way that suggested he had daughters himself. Then we stood. No one quite knew whether to leave together. Families often assume the dramatic moment is the event itself. It usually isn't. It is the hallway after, the parking lot, the doorway, the place where legal reality ends and relational reality has to decide what to do with itself. The five of us ended up in the parking lot under a sky the color of cold tin. Daniel put his keys in his pocket and said, "I need some time." Joanna said, "I think we all do." Mark looked at me. He said, "I'm not angry. I just feel stupid." That was honest enough that I almost laughed but didn't. Emily came over and hugged me first. She had always been the one quickest to move physically toward pain when she saw it, even when she did not yet know what to say. She held on longer than usual. She whispered, "I should have known." I put one hand on her back and said, "Maybe." She cried harder at that, which is how I knew she understood what I meant. Not accusation, just the sorrow of missed perception. Daniel and Joanna left first, separately but within the same minute, which felt appropriate. Mark lingered by his truck for a while and finally said, "For what it's worth, Dad always liked that you knew which fence posts were failing before the cows ever got got out. I looked at him. He shrugged. It's not nothing. No, I said. It wasn't. Then he left too. I drove back to the house alone. If you have ever returned to a place after the story everyone else told about it has finally been corrected, you know the feeling. The place itself does not look triumphant. It just looks like itself. The mailbox leaning slightly right. The gravel drive that needed another load before winter. The white paint on the west porch rail starting to chalk. The sugar maple near the side yard already turning at the top before the lower branches caught up. The house did not know it had just survived a dispute. It stood there in the ordinary dignity of things that have never needed permission to belong to themselves. I parked beside the garage apartment where I still lived even though the main house had been legally mine for years. That surprises people sometimes, but grief rearranges practical decisions more slowly than television would suggest. After my mother died, I could not make myself sleep in her room downstairs or my father's old room upstairs or in any of the spaces where the air still seemed to hold the pattern of their lives. So I remained in the apartment over the garage for another 5 months and went into the house each morning with coffee and a notebook and a list of small maintenance tasks the same way I had for years. Daniel called 2 weeks later. Not text, not a group message. A phone call on a Sunday afternoon, which I noticed because he knew very well our father had reserved Sunday calls for obligations he intended to treat as meaningful rather than efficient. He did not apologize immediately. That would not have been like him. Instead he said, Howard sent me a copy of the transfer paperwork. Dad's handwriting is all over the margin notes. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'd forgotten he always wrote tax figures as if they were measurements for lumber. I smiled despite myself. He did. Another pause. Daniel said, did Mom really say that about the child who understood the difference between visiting and staying? Yes. He exhaled, long and slow. I thought I was there more than I was, he said. That was not an apology either. It was harder than one. It was the first accurate sentence. I said, you were there the way you knew how to be. He let that sit between us. Then he said, I keep thinking about the realtor. About that day. I sounded awful. You sounded certain, I said. He gave a short laugh. That's one word for it. We talked for 19 minutes. About our father's notebook. About the porch step. About whether the barn roof would make it through another winter without repair. Not intimate exactly, but true. That was more than we had managed in years. Joanna took longer. She came in November, alone, on a Tuesday, in a camel coat almost identical to the one the realtor had worn, which I considered privately a kind of irony my mother would have appreciated. She stood on the porch holding a bakery box and looking at the fields as if she needed to orient herself before facing me. I opened the door. She said, I brought scones, which was not a sentence designed to solve anything but was at least a sentence aimed at the correct house. I let her in. We sat at the kitchen table where my mother had once ordered sheet music and my father had once paid invoices and where I had signed school permission slip, divorce papers, and hospice forms years apart and for different lives. Joanna put cream in her coffee without asking where we kept it, which told me she remembered more than I had been giving her credit for. She said, I have been trying to decide whether I'm hurt because they didn't tell me or because I think they were right not to. I said, those can coexist. She nodded. Then, after a minute, I think I made lists because lists let me imagine I was participating in things I didn't know how to bear in person. That was the closest Joanna had ever come, with me at least, to naming vulnerability without dressing it as analysis. I said, you did participate. She looked around the kitchen. Yes, she said, but not like you did. No, I said. We sat there for a while with that truth. Not hostile, not fixed, just present. Before she left, she asked if she could walk through the house. Of course, I said. She moved room to room slowly, touching almost nothing. In the den she stood beside the sewing room doorway where my mother's bed had been and looked out at the pasture. At the front staircase she said, I don't think I understood until now that Mom stopped going upstairs before I ever noticed. I leaned against the wall. There are a lot of things no one notices when someone else is already there to notice them, I said. She flinched slightly, and I regretted the sharpness the moment it left my mouth, but she only nodded. Yes, she said. I think that's true. Mark came in December with a ladder and enough shingles to patch the barn roof whether I agreed or not. He did not frame it as an apology. He framed it as weather preparedness, which was emotionally more comfortable for him and therefore acceptable to me. While we worked, he said, I used to tell people you lived here because it was easier for you than leaving. I climbed down one rung and looked at him. He added, I realize now that saying something is easier is not the same as saying it cost nothing. No, I said, it isn't. He nodded and handed me the tool belt. Emily understood first and best, which did not surprise me. Sometimes the youngest child in a family of strong performances is the only one who still trusts softness enough to see clearly through it. She came with her daughter in early spring to help plant peonies where the old ones had thinned out. We worked in damp soil while her little girl carried the trowel around like a ceremonial object, and Emily told me she had reread our mother's letter 3 times. She said, I kept thinking she was talking about the house, but she was talking about being willing to have your life shaped by someone else's daily need. Yes, I said. Emily brushed dirt from her hands. That's the part none of us understood. Maybe, I said. Or maybe it's the part no one understands until they have to live it. By summer, something had changed among us. Not a miracle, not full transformation. Families rarely become new. They become slightly more honest versions of their old selves. Daniel now called to ask about the orchard fence instead of to advise me what should be done about it. Joanna sent me an article on life estate planning with a note that said, for what it's worth, Mom's legal instincts were excellent. Mark showed up with tools more often and opinions less. Emily simply came. I moved into the main house in August. The first night I slept in my own bedroom there. I stood for a long time at the kitchen sink after washing up the tea mug and looked out over the side yard where my mother used to watch finches at dusk. The light fell exactly the way I remembered from childhood and from 6 years ago and from every unremarkable weekday between. It struck me then that inheritance is not always the acquisition of a thing. Sometimes it is the permission to stop defending why the thing mattered to you in the first place. My parents had not given me the house because I was stronger or more deserving in some grand moral way. They had given it to me because I was already living the life the house required. They had seen that clearly, more clearly, perhaps, than I had allowed myself to see it. That was their final gift, not property, recognition. The deed sits now in the top drawer of the desk in the front room beside my father's old notebook and one of my mother's handwritten grocery lists from the week before she died. Not because I need the legal proof often, because I like the company it keeps. Numbers in his hand, necessities in hers. The paperwork of a life built quietly enough that other people mistook it for stillness. That is my story. A realtor on the porch, a letter in an attorney's office, and a house that had already been given to the child who knew the difference between visiting and staying. If this stayed with you, share it with someone who has ever done the invisible work in a family and watched other people count only what they could see. Drop a comment and tell me whether you think the parents were right. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.